Destiny Martin with the LCSC Pathfinder. Can you lend any insights into the possibility that the murder weapon is linked to the ROTC program? And also you mentioned that the analysis unit is here. Will we be able to hear anything from them about a working profile they possibly have? And on that note, have you guys ruled out the possibility that the killer might be a female?
So we look at every avenue. We're looking at every group of people. Like I said early in our first press conference, we're not going to let any stone go unturned. I believe can you just clarify your second portion of that question?
Salutations, friends, and welcome to Research Paper. Here we have Wrath and Relationships, Homicide Weapon Choice, and Victim-Offender Relationships by Joseph Ganella, Old Dominion University. And this is a partial fulfillment for his Master's of Applied Sociology. And it looks here, it was May of 2021, which is fairly recent. Thank you all for being here. Welcome back. We have a lot to discuss. Before we get into this paper. So, lots of information. I'm going to be going over a few different topics, as well as hitting on the Karen Reed case, because there are a lot of parallels of her case that reflect what's going on in the Bryan Kohberger case, who is the defendant of this crime, of these 4 homicides. First, we'll talk about the intro video. Now, I cut off Ms. Martin because she rambled on a little bit when Fry asked her to elaborate on her second question, which was, since the FBI behavioral unit was there, will they be looking into the possibility that a female committed these crimes? Which is a great question. And the first question she had was, will they be looking at the ROTC program at the university? Because there are K-bar knives there at the ROTC program. K-bar knives and knife sheaths. 2 excellent questions, which I want to say they were so excellent that they ended up doing a little deep dive on Ms. Martin, and they found out that the news source that she said she was affiliated with was not true, and they discredit her as a fake journalist, even though she asked the best questions out of all the quote-unquote journalists that were there. Oddly enough, I believe she ended up being in a major car accident, and she ended up as being deceased. I want to say within the year. Don't quote me on that. As for the white truck, yes, they are not the same. They are not the same white trucks. I just found it intriguing that 3 of the victims are found with footage that's not them, that someone else takes, where there is a white truck driving by them. The Xana Kernodle one, that's her sister recording her, and that is footage that we are told that is at a business when they're walking from the walking from the corner club to the grub truck. That was quite the song by the Beatles. That's back in 1936, the Clean Cut Beatles, but it's a very relevant song considering the information we'll be going through, where it's basically about intimate partner violence, that song. Moving forward, this is for educational purposes. We'll be using adult language, adult words, adult topics, adult methodology, objective commentary, and being as professional as possible. If these topics that we're going to discuss in this video may be uncomfortable for some, as it should be, because we don't really talk about these topics naturally. I mean, where are you going to talk about them? At work, at your school, when you see your family? But sometimes maybe we should, just so that, as Mr. Rogers says, if it's mentionable, it's manageable. And that this way it doesn't allow those who do perpetrate have almost a protective shield because of the lack of discussion. So with that song, it's definitely, in my opinion, based on intimate partner violence. And that is definitely a topic we'll be hitting on here when it comes to, in the title, it's about the relationships of the offender and the perpetrator. We will be talking about the Bryan Kohberger case in regards to the current information. I'm just going to hit on that first. It almost is becoming cyclical. We get a new photo of Bryan Kohberger right before a hearing, it seems. This time it's leaked information with a video, which is interesting. I've watched it. I haven't really watched it. I've seen snippets of it, but I will watch it. I find it interesting that it's not like two photoshopped photos of the defendant who's in jail. Okay. And I put that photo purposefully in the intro of the four that are wearing those black robes. I'd use it in a previous video as well. I think I'm going to use it as a thumbnail and do like a side-by-side. And we are getting more information about the wounds of the victims. We are learning from a court document that there were multiple weapons used on Keely Goncalves. And we also learned from her dad, Steve Goncalves, that she was punched in the face, which is that's a specific action that is done to victims in these papers that I have read, punching the victim in the face. I find that appropriate now to be talking about this because we're learning about the relationships of the offender to the victim. In the document that was brought to our attention the 24th of April, I had mentioned it a little bit about Madison Mogen and how the expert witness, Gary, states that she was intoxicated to the point where she was unable to defend herself. I put that more in the description. I've also mentioned that she more than likely got those DNA evidence underneath her fingernails from the fingernail clippings because of defensive wounds, meaning she gave them the defensive wounds. She, in my opinion, scratched them or grabbed their clothing or whatever, and they will have defensive wounds. That's what I was describing. I do find it interesting that in the beginning we were told that there were no signs of sexual assault. I, as myself as others, believe that was not to be true because, for me, one, of where the setting is. They're right by Greek Row, their age, they're female, vibrant individuals, and the male, I'm sure he was a heartbreaker, so to speak. There were a couple, Xana and Ethan, and just them being affiliated or associated with the Greek industry. And there are so many research papers out there of the amount of sexual assaults that happen within the fraternities across the board. With this video, I'll be playing other videos while I'm reading this, and you'll be able to listen and watch, or just listen, or do both. Several of those videos will be Kathy Mabbitt, who was the coroner, and those videos I'll be showing of her talking about the wounds of these victims. And we can see, as time goes, just kind of refresh ourselves, as well as Ann Burgess, who is a boss. Ann Burgess, like Kathy Mabut, started off as registered nurses and then went into the criminal justice field. But with Ann Burgess, with her career, the Netflix series Mindhunter is based on her earlier work. The redhead in that series is representing Ann Burgess. And I will be putting videos of her at a podcast called Surviving the Survivor. I did use that podcast, or the professionals that were there. I use them a lot in my earlier videos. The other two people that were there was Gary Bucato, who is a professor, and then Jeff, who is a former FBI agent. Gary Bucato was talking about his research paper, and he was discussing how, because there were 4 victims found at one scene, it's considered a massacre. Many people were thinking that it was a serial killing because the FBI was there. It may be. We may find out in the future that it is, but because there's 4 victims found at the scene, it is considered a massacre. Jeff, the former FBI agent, his contribution, well, he was not supposed to be there. He just happened to stop by at that time. He spoke about his experience being gang activity, gang related. What he found, though, is that, like, drug cartel. And it sounds, this scene at 1122 sounds like drug cartel type activity, which the amount of brutality that was there. But with the drug cartels, they leave no one alive. Everyone is dead. Even the ones who try to escape, they get them and make sure that they're dead. Even babies. But at 1122, what we know of is that there are 2 survivors that were there at the time, and that one of them, Dylan, allegedly saw one of the perpetrators, which is very unusual for any case where there's those types of brutal killings happening, that anyone is left alive, especially when one person sees them, which alerted a lot of us. And Ann and Gary both mentioned how, even though they said there was no signs of sexual assault, that per the perpetrator, in using a knife and the amount of stabbings and possibly where the stabbings were, that is a sign of sexual assault per the perpetrator. We also learned that in that same document with the experts, that with the forensic scientists, if you're going to call yourself a scientist or have that label, please make sure you actually do the science from beginning to end and all the way through. We learned that they pretty much picked and choose what evidence to take and what evidence not to do. So we learned about the glove, the blood in the glove, and we learned about the hand railing, the blood on the hand railing, which we find out was not done at the time. It was collected but not completed. And we also learned in that document, this recent one on April 24th, that Jenny will discuss in court why they did not collect evidence and run the evidence of the mattress, Maddie Mogan's mattress, where 2 of the victims, Kaylee and Maddie, were both on that mattress. Many of us have seen pictures of it, and it definitely looks like it has large amount of blood stains on it. So they did not collect any evidence of the mattress or the bed frame. But they do with a knife sheath that's on the bed. And it's skin cells. And they do not do any further testing on the knife sheath to see if any of the victim's DNA was on the knife sheath, to connect the knife sheath to the crime scene. And now we're learning more about Bryan Kohberger's phone activity, which I would like to see that done on cross. If you're not watching the Karen Reed trial, I highly recommend it, because there are reflections. For the Bryan Kohberger case, a lot of the state's material, I guess, is his cell phone data, as well as for Karen Reed, but mostly for the state. Celebrite will be testifying for the state for Bryan Kohberger case, and they also recently just testified for Karen Reed case. In this description, I'm going to put in the testimony of Ian Whiffen. He was the first person on the witness stand for a Celebrite, and he gives some good terminology and groundwork to learn about, so that when we listen to Celebrite at the Bryan Kohberger case for the state, which is going to be a husband and wife team, we'll be able to compare and contrast. Real quick with Ian, he did let us know with excellent cross from the defense team that the phone was corrupted before he even received it, and that the software was changed. Celebrite changed their software for their client, which is law enforcement. Celebrite changed their software for their client, which is law enforcement. And the second witness, Jessica Hyde, also concurred with that as well. So Celebrite changed their software for their client, law enforcement. So in this case with Karen Reed, it's Jennifer McCabe, because she looked up house long to die in cold at 2:27. So they changed their software for Jennifer McCabe as well as for a client in Germany. We also learned with Ian that not only was her phone corrupted when he received it, but you can see that someone went in there and tried to hide their tracks. We also learned that you can get a radius of the phone of where it's located, and we see that it was located in the home in 3 different areas, if I recall correctly, as well as we learn that they can see when and how the phone is used, meaning when it was used facial recognition to open it, did they use their fingerprint or type in their passcode, as well as use the sign button to shut it off, to stop activity. I think the state thought they had a gaudy moment by telling us about the temperature of the battery, how it dropped significantly, which at the end, we pretty much learned that, yes, the battery did drop a significant temperature twice. Once, it looks like it dropped significantly, meaning he was either in the basement or out in the garage, and then it dropped again, meaning outside. So all in all, when the defense finished their crossing of both expert witnesses for the state, ended up looking better for the state, or excuse me, for the defense. So those state witnesses helped the defense, in my opinion, as well as many others. Hopefully the jury will get it. I believe from what we've been hearing with the insiders who are in court to be able to see who the jury members are, it sounds like the jury members are younger, like in their 30s, which means they're going to understand cell phone data and how a cell phone works, more so than people who are like, I think Gen Xers would know. And I even think even people old and other, I think people are becoming more aware of cell phone and how to use them and what's going on. That's my opinion. Just because of the amount of people who depend on their cell phone would be more apt to learn about it because they can relate to it more than any other type of evidence. That's my opinion. And here's another great reflection for the Karen Reed case is the shoddy work that the police officers did in the investigation aspect. The defense was able to show the jury at how they deliberately and purposefully botched the evidence and how they are not able to collect evidence properly or even follow a chain of command or label it properly. If you did not watch the first trial, you're fine, because I did not watch it either. I just got the tail end of it where the jury was ready to be released, but before they did, the Albert showed up and sat in court for the first time and just sat there and stared them down, which is a definition of witness intimidation. Not what Aiden Carney is doing, is not anything near what the Alberts did. So in regards to the police work, the defense was definitely able to show the jury how they purposefully did not do their job. It doesn't look like incompetence. It looks like they just didn't do it, and they just did not take it seriously, and they didn't care. They clearly were able to show that, especially with the recent cross of Trooper Butnick, who is a sergeant. He literally got caught, well, not literally, but he got caught with his pants down in front of the jury. This is in regards to the shoe of John O'Keefe, the victim. His shoe was collected at 34 Fairview, which is at the crime scene, while the other shoe was collected in the hospital. One of the shoes was opened in an evidence bag. I want to say it's the right shoe. And then when Trooper Butnick opened up the evidence bag of another shoe, it was also a right shoe. It looked like a right shoe. And he said that the shoe he collected was at the hospital, but on the actual bag, it's labeled 34 Fairview. And he even looked at the bag and was like, oh shit. He had the oh shit look and body language. So they showed the jury that, as well as telling the jury how he collected taillight from the scene, and he just collected it and didn't even put it in evidence for like weeks. And when he finally went to go put it in evidence, he just handed it to someone else, and then they went ahead and put it in for him. But he doesn't recognize the handwriting. Bullshit. Since that case, if you're not following it, the lead investigator, formal Trooper Proctor, is now disgraced Trooper Proctor. He's been fired. So the defense was able to show how difficult it is to get any of these officers to be fired, even with doing terrible police work or any work whatsoever. Formal Trooper Proctor, his supervisor is Trooper Butnick, which is who was just on the stand recently. And because of his terrible police work, Proctor, and his supervisor is Butnick, he got, I think, 4 to 5 days of leave. And I want to say it was with sick pay. And the defense brought that up to show how they get treated when one of their subordinates does really awful, terrible work to the point where they get fired. So it's a lot of good information is coming out in that case that is a reflection of the Bryan Kohberger case, which we have been watching the hearings, and the amount of terrible police work that has been done. It is not incompetence. And hopefully the defense in Bryan Kohberger case can show how terrible the police work is done. It's not because of incompetence. It's because they know how to pick and choose what to do and what not to do. And that is premeditated. That's planned. And it's just frustrating because the state is supposed to represent the victims, meaning the victim is John O'Keefe. The state of Massachusetts is supposed to represent the victim to make sure they get the right person who committed the crime in jail. And it's looking more and more that Karen Reed was framed. As per this case with Bryan Kohberger, the state is supposed to represent the victims of Xana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin, Madison Mogen, and Kaylee Goncalves. The state is supposed to represent the victims to make sure whoever committed those crimes is in jail to protect to protect us, the citizens. Mostly to protect the citizens of Idaho. And I find it interesting that recently, Ashlyn Couch's mom has spoken out and saying that Ashlyn has left Idaho. She no longer lives in Idaho, that she fears for her life. Why is she fearing for her life when we're told the person who committed the crime is in jail? We also have learned that 2 of the Goncalves' daughters who are in college out of state. Which I can understand them because, it's a family member and that's all happened and the amount of attention they get. But with Ashlyn Couch, why are you moving out of Idaho? Why are you fearing for your life? And I also find it weird that Madison is now labeled more as best friends with Ashlyn and not Kaylee. I can understand why they became good friends. I mean, they lived together at 1122 the year prior to this crime. And they definitely probably grew very close. But we didn't learn anything about the 6th roommate, which is Ashlyn Couch, until later on in the investigation, which I find it interesting that wasn't brought up first. So much. And I feel like we're being cyclical again with why didn't the Goncalves go to the crime scene when they heard about Kaylee being, if you heard anything, I apologize. So, there was yelling going on. It's the neighbors. I don't have the best neighbors. I don't know if anyone else has had, I think there's actual TV shows about it, about terrible neighbors. I have had one house in particular with two sets of terrible neighbors. It's to the point where I even want to go in my own backyard, which I have a great backyard. And moving on. But we were talking about the Goncalves and not going to the crime scene. So I did my own little blind study on this topic. I've already have given my opinion. I would not have gone to the crime scene if I learned about, when learning, hypothetically, if I had a 21-year-old daughter who's an hour and a half away at her university and I hear the information, I would not have gone down to the crime scene. And I am a licensed medical professional who has been in many codes throughout my career. I run to the danger. And I have also drove up to a motorcycle accident where it was a couple. It's a pretty remote highway along Lake Ontario. It's quite expansive. I don't even know how large it is, but it's pretty much along Lake Ontario. It's called the Parkway. So it's like in central and western New York. And it's maintained better nowadays in regards to like potholes and stuff, but has very few lights and a lot of deer. So you have to be very careful when you go down this parkway, when you use it. So in this particular case, I was driving down the parkway and it's a motorcycle accident. I see just a bunch of people on the side of the road, cars parked on the side of the road, and a group of people gathered around one particular person. So I just finished my shift. I pull over and I'm just making sure that 911 is called, because I've learned in my trainings, basic CPR, American Heart Association, that is the number one aspect of these types of accidents, that 911 never even gets called because everyone assumes everyone else did it. So I was just making sure that 911 was being called. So I park my car. I look and I see a male and other people, and I said, was 911 called? And one person said, yep, I called them. They said they're on their way, and for us to stand here and wait until the ambulance comes or the police come first. And the guy looks at me and says, I'm okay, but she's not. And I look over and she is at the side of the road, face down. So I walk over to her. I don't touch her. I don't move her. I just talk to her. And what we've learned in the medical profession, that even though you think that people can't hear you, more than likely they can. So I just let her know the ambulance is coming, so on and so forth. But I did not touch her. And I just was paying attention to her breathing. And once her breathing started changing, Chain Stokes is what it's called. Thankfully, the ambulance showed up, and I kind of like ran to them, like her breathing just changed, so on and so forth. So when I tell my coworkers about this, the first thing they said to me was, "You're stupid for doing that. You know how crazy you are for even doing that?" And it's because you can become liable by just trying to be helpful. Hello, Richard Allen. He was trying to be helpful, and look what happened. That's an extreme case, but I'm sure many of us have heard how people became liable after trying to help someone at a scene of an accident by, mostly it's because of moving them. It ends up making the injury worse. Hello, Karen Reed. We learned in this trial that John O'Keefe, his body was turned over by either Carrie Roberts or Jen McCabe, or both. He was turned over by them, which the state prosecutor is blaming Karen Reed for not calling 911 sooner, or not getting to the scene of the accident sooner, because she could have helped saved him by alerting an ambulance to come and get him. Now, if anyone else turned John O'Keefe over, they would have been held liable. So, with that being said, when I was there at that accident, the scene of the accident, there was a trooper going around asking if anyone turned the body over or touched the body, which really rubbed me the wrong way, and I left after I gave my very minimal report to the ambulance. So when I asked my coworkers and people I know about this case, I asked two specific groups. Ones who I know of who have run to be a part of a code, and the other ones I asked who I know who, when there is a code, run the other way. They've never been in one and they run the other way. And that's fine. But because you're in a hospital setting and there's plenty of other people to do it, and you have everything that you need to be there. That's a controlled setting. You've got people around you that can help. You have the proper equipment. They choose not to be a part of it. Some people just don't want a part of it, and that's their choice. Even though they're medical professionals, but they give in other ways. I'll give them that. So when I tell these medical professionals, hypothetically speaking, you have a daughter, an hour and a half away at college, she's 21 years old, and you get a phone call from a family member saying something bad has happened and they believe that your daughter is dead. So you start calling her phone, and then you start calling her roommate's phone, who is her best friend since middle school, and you're not getting any response from that. What would you do? So the ones, like me, who run to the danger to help, said, I'm staying home. I'm waiting for the authorities to come. I'm waiting to see what to do next. While the ones who don't run to the danger said that they would go to the scene of the crime. I just found that fascinating. It blew my mind. It blew my mind. Blew my mind. That the ones who said that they would go down to the scene of the crime were the ones who don't even do codes for their own work and are in the proper setting to do it. People like me, and when I got kind of chastised, were like, do you know how much trouble you can get yourself into if you go to a scene of a crime like that and you become liable? You become now part of the story. You become part of the narrative without your own liking. You're now on their turf, is what we were saying. You're going to a crime scene with a bunch of other law enforcement agencies and people. You're on their turf, and you're on their rules. So I just let you guys marinate on that. I found that fascinating. And it was my own little one. It doesn't really mean that much, but we're not going to use that to generalize all over the place, but that was my little sample size. All right. What a way to transition into offender relationships. Okay, so this is a great paper, a great thesis. We definitely have had several amazing other theses. This one is, I think it's just the work or the amount of material they have to work with is, I think, a part of the issue with some of these papers that I've been reading and the research papers, not so much the thesis. It's just because, well, as we're learning about the shoddy work of police officers, it's going to be hard to get good material and good data when, if it's not properly investigated or even properly documented, you're not going to get good information to be able to try to get an idea for future cases or to look at them enough to understand what's going on, because you don't have good foundational work. We'll also look at another research paper, real quick, because this is about 40 pages, is changing of the crime scene, how that is more of a behavior of a lot of homicides, of altering the crime scene. And that can be in various ways. It could be just moving the bodies. It could be covering their face, covering their body, positioning their bodies, cleaning up the crime scene, which many people believed. That's why it took them 8 hours. And now we're learning through court documents that the defense has found evidence that it definitely looks as though it was cleaned up. So here is the abstract. The purpose of this study is to examine the influence that victim-offender relationships and the event circumstances have on homicide weapon choice. Cornish and Clark's rational choice theoretical perspective, offenders go through decision-making processes to determine which weapon will be the most effective to meet their goal. Based on the circumstances of the event, this study examined the use of 3 weapon types: firearms, knife, blunt objects, and personal weapons, amongst victim-offender relationships such as acquaintance, intimate, non-intimate, family, friend, and strangers, along with circumstances such as homicides committed as a result of a felony and homicides committed as a result of an argument, which we heard at 13:30. If you hear a beep, I got one of those vibrational plates to put under my desk because I sit for hours doing these, and this helps keeps the circulation going. This study examined the use of 3 weapon types: firearms, knife, blunt objects, and personal weapons, amongst victim-offender relationships such as acquaintance, intimate, non-intimate, family, friend, and strangers, along with circumstances such as homicides committed as a result of a felony and of the argument. So we heard an argument at 13:30. We heard Xana and Ethan's name there. We definitely heard some type of an altercation. And while a knife, blunt objects, and personal weapons were used the most by non-intimate family friends and in argument circumstances. Acknowledgements. Here's a table of contents. So I have read through this a few times, and we'll just kind of skim through the literature review. And we'll kind of skim through here. We'll just jump around. We'll definitely go through the methodology and the data analysis as well as the results. But as a literature review, we'll go through it a little bit just to get an understanding of the type of information that he used to kind of get a background of previous research that has been used and kind of give good points of how, yes, this makes sense and we can see that, or as this does not make sense and it does not because of the way it was labeled and how they categorized the relationships of the offender to the victim. So here is the introduction, Chapter 1. The spine-chilling sight of Michael Myers wielding his large kitchen knife in an attempt to kill his sister has spanned across 12 Halloween movies. Why did Michael Myers choose a knife? This is a rhetorical question that viewers of the movie asked after the incident. He could have easily achieved his goal using a more effective weapon, such as a firearm. The viewers can infer that his choice of weapon is influenced by the type of relationship that he and his potential victim had. Since the intended victim is his sister, their relationship is more meaningful to Michael, to the extent that the use of a knife was more gratifying and fulfilling than the use of a firearm or different weapon. Although this example is a fictional antidote, the notion that a homicide offender's choice of weapon can be influenced by the victim-offender relationship cannot be ignored. There is a multitude of relevant studies with a focus on analyzing weapon choice among homicide offenders. There is as well is an unlimited number of objects that can be used to commit a murder. Nonetheless, there is a paucity of research that address reasons behind weapon choice and offender relationship. This study seeks to examine reasons behind weapon choice and offender relationships as they pertain to murder and non-negligent manslaughter. The FBI defines murder and non-negligent manslaughter as the willful killing of one human being by another. And this is of 2016. According to the FBI Uniform Crime Report homicide data from 2013 to 2017, a total of 15,129 homicides were committed in 2017. 10,982 were committed using a firearm, 72.6%, as opposed to a total of 1,591 homicides were committed using a knife, 10.5%. Furthermore, 28% of homicide victims were killed by someone they knew other than family members, acquaintance, neighbor, friend, boyfriend, etc. 12.3% were killed by family members and 9.7% were killed by strangers. The relationships for the remaining 50% was undetermined. And this is 2017. And this undetermined, I learned through other papers, is either by, it's mostly because of the category of how they've been categorized, and as well as the lack of information, or if it wasn't looked into more of the initial police investigation, because this information is put into the FBI database. In addition, an analysis conducted by Decker found that in St. Louis, 70% of all homicides were committed with a firearm. Interestingly, Decker, 1993, also that firearms were used most frequently amongst all relationship types. Between relatives and intimate partners, the use of a knife was nearly doubled that of other victim-offender relationship categories. Decker's 1993 findings provide merit to Michael Myers' narrative, which I always think about Steve Goncalves saying, this isn't some Hollywood script or some Hollywood movie, which it's got to be difficult having people talk about your daughter's death like this. I can understand that. And, just with me talking about them not going to the crime scene, I mean, I don't have a 21-year-old daughter that's an hour and a half away at a university. But just with my personal experience of what I just mentioned to you, and even though I've never been in that type of situation, I was just trying to make sure that 911 was called. I knew enough not to even get near or around enough of the victim at that time, just because of the amount of times you hear of people getting screwed over, of trying to help other people. And I mean, who knows? I could be totally wrong from this. And if so, I would definitely learn of why I was wrong and what I missed and how I could have seen it, maybe gain more knowledge of why I didn't understand what had happened. So I'm just going where the evidence is leading to. And unfortunately, on many of these cases, the three that I've mentioned, the evidence doesn't look good from the state to help convict the person they said who did it. And the burden is on the state. That's their burden of proof. And the amount of publicity is needed to help skew the public's, I guess, thoughts on who actually did it. They do a lot of work to make him look guilty, which has always bothered me and still does now. One must also consider the circumstance surrounding the murder as having an influence on weapon choice. The FBI was able to collect data regarding the circumstance of which 59.8% of the murders were committed, where 39% of victims were murdered during arguments and romantic triangles, which that is what Stacy Chapin said. This is not some type of weird romantic triangle, which I felt like she was held hostage in that video. Maybe she just seemed that way because she was held hostage of the circumstance she was in, having to do this interview for the news based on her own son's murder, which is, who wants to be a part of that? That's terrible. And then you have to still be a mom to your other two children, his two siblings. It is weird, but I also find it very strange, and this is my opinion, this is the way I see it. I also find it very strange, like the amount of hustling she was doing after his death. Like she had bills to get paid. Writing a book, I can totally see that, because that will help with the healing process for her and her family. Totally understand that. But then to like go on a press tour with it, as well as selling these blue glasses, it rubbed me the wrong way. It was like she had bills to pay and she took her opportunity to do it. And I don't know if you're aware of this. And I'm only thinking of this because, on a side note, it's now a charity, Ethan Smiles, which is a wonderful charity to have to help with grieving the death of your son. I just went to Taco Bell for the first time in years because I was craving like one of their sweet drinks. And it's a charity. It's a charity. Taco Bell is a charity. Hold on. All right. So it says, I noticed it on the receipt. It says Taco Bell Foundation is a public 501c3 charitable organization. So I don't know how that works. I don't know how that happens. I don't know that much about commerce. I just found that interesting. All right, so one must also consider the circumstance surrounding the murder as having an influence on weapon choice. The FBI was able to collect data regarding the circumstance of which 59.8% of the murders were committed, where 39% of victims were murdered during arguments and romantic triangles. The remaining 20.8% considered felony-type murders that occurred concurrently with the commission of another felony, such as rape, robbery, burglary, which they said in the beginning when Bryan Kohberger was charged with 4 homicides and burglary, which, if they knew in the beginning that the way the crime scene was, that this was someone that they knew, and now they changed their minds and they're saying that it's basically a stranger, and they added burglary to it, even though there was no signs of forced entry, which that doesn't mean necessarily that doesn't mean it's a burglary. But we don't know if anything was taken, and were the parents involved to see if anything was taken. which the way they were moving things in and out of that house, who knows what the hell was going on. But since then, that burglary charge has been dropped. So then what was the motive? Fox and Allen, 2013, expanded upon Decker's 1993 study and found that males use firearms when killing non-family members when the surrounding circumstance falls into the felony type category. Additionally, males who kill female acquaintances and family members are more likely to use personal weapons, hands and feet, or blunt objects. Females who kill family members and acquaintances are associated with using a knife. This finding is consistent with the notion that women may commit homicide to escape the violence of an abusive relationship, and the only means of survival is to kill their abuser. Purpose of the study is to examine the influence that victim-offender relationships and the event circumstances have on homicide weapon choice. Significance of the study. With a better understanding of what drives offenders to choose a particular type of weapon against their victims based on their relationships, potential policy implications can lower future victimizations. Also, there has been some discrepancy in how victim-offender relationships have been categorized in previous research. This study will attempt to provide a more structured classification of relationship types, which can offer unyielding use for future studies to expand upon. With fluctuating homicide rates year after year, there is a continuous need for additional research into the topic of homicide. So here's the literature review, and we'll start off with this, and then as we get a good understanding of what's going on, then we'll go to his part of his study. This chapter examines previous literature regarding the association between the weapon used in a homicide and the victim-offender relationship. The chapter begins with the discussion of research pertaining to acquaintance, stranger relationships, and intimate relative relationships. The distinction between these relationship types is important to understand homicide offender choice of weapon. Following the review of previous literature, rational choice theory will be presented along with a summary and critique of the literature. The chapter will close with a preview of the research question. So, acquaintance and stranger relationship. Prior literature suggests that victim-offender relationships cannot be classified into simple dichotomous stranger versus non-stranger groups. There are many different levels of victim-offender relationships that are much more involved than two simple groups. In addition, the definition of an acquaintance has been rather ambiguous when studying the relationship between victims and offenders. In 1993, Decker studied 792 reported homicides in St. Louis from 1985 to 1989 to examine the relationship between victim-offender characteristics and motive, individual attributes, and event characteristics. In this study, motive was characterized as either instrumental or expressive. And you'll see this a lot in other studies that I will hopefully would try to continue more research papers talking about this. After this thesis and learning about this, let me know in the comments if you want me to continue and any ideas you have, you want me to look into it more. But this is used a lot, and if I recall correctly, a lot of the former FBI agents who were on mass media talking about this case in the very beginning talked about it instrumental and expressive. And this is prior to the arrest of Bryan Kohberger. So instrumental means that the offender is seeking to achieve personal growth or gain and has rationally calculated their actions to minimize risk and meet their goal. On the other hand, expressive motives fail to include rational thinking, where the offender acts on impulse or in self-defense. So what we know now and what I just read there, in my opinion, Bryan Kohberger does not follow any of those categories or any of those two. Because instrumental means that the offender is seeking to achieve personal growth or gain and has rationally calculated their actions to minimize risk and meet their goal. Well, he's at high risk, number one, because he's never been into the home. And granted, there's house plans all over the place, but looking at blueprints and then going into the home is totally different. I mean, I watched that Jeff Lewis when he flips houses, and contractors have a hard time just looking at blueprints and making sure that they're putting the door in the right spot and measuring correctly. I'm sure a lot of it has to do where they can do change orders, but even they have a hard time looking at blueprints. So for a complete stranger to go in there by just looking at Zwillow at the time to know how to navigate through that house, which we went through that a little bit, how there's so many weird angles and nooks and crannies that it's a difficult house to visualize just from on the out at a two-dimensional aspect. So to have a three-dimensional going in there, that's going to be difficult. And many of the professionals like Ann Burgess, I want to say she even said like he would have to know how to navigate through that house. And she mentions that it would be important to interview people who lived there previously before the victims did. So as well as, Kaylee just got that brand new car. She did not live there for a duration of time prior and just happened to be there right before this happened with her new car. That is a risk. Having a full house is a risk. And minimizing your risk is having a roommate see you, allegedly. Enough where she says, I know he looked at me because I saw his eyebrows. So that tells me that he must have seen her as well. So that is not minimizing your risk at all. Granted, you met your goal, but not with all of this in place. And then with expressive, motives fail to include rational thinking, where the offender acts on impulse or in self-defense. So if I remember correctly, this was Jennifer Koffendorfer. I did cover her in one of my earlier videos. And she was saying it was expressive, that he went in and just started stabbing everyone he saw to get to the one person he needed to do. And she literally was like doing stabbing motions and moving around like a crazy person. So I have a hard time thinking he just happened to walk in there and just on an impulse started killing 4 people. And then just go on with his day. This is terrible. It's terrible. The individual attributes are aggregated into age, race, and gender. More importantly, to the present study, the event characteristics are classified into the presence of type of weapon, guns, personal contact, other, location of the event, and number of suspects. Decker does not include friends and strangers in the acquaintance category because friends have too much familiarity to be deemed as an acquaintance, and strangers have too little familiarity. Acquaintance homicide accounts for the largest percentage, 46% of homicides, as Decker observed. Within the scope of Decker's study, 74% of acquaintance homicides were committed using a firearm. Similarly, 75% of stranger homicides were committed using firearm. Which makes sense, there's no connection to it. The more purposive the weapon, the less familiar the offender has with the victim. Purposive weapons are more planned out and calculated, meaning the offender brought that weapon to the scene to commit the homicide. Purposive meaning with a purpose, going in there with a direct goal, in and out. A similar study was conducted by Fox and Allen in 2004 to assess instrumental and expressive categories of homicide, such as victim-offender relationship and the type of weapon used. This study analyzed 30 years, 1980 to 2009, of Uniform Crime Report supplementary homicide data with a sample size of 208,219 homicides. In using correspondence and analysis, the researchers created a new variable code, VOR, victim-offender relationship. This variable combines the gender of the offender, the gender of the victim, and their type of relationship. So MF, acquaintance. So male offender, female victim, acquaintance. And then MM\ACQ equals male offender, male victim, acquaintance. Fox and Allen's findings for acquaintance homicide and weapons used are rather interesting based on gender. The total number of males killing male acquaintance is 87,943. Of that total, 71% of males who kill male acquaintance use a firearm. The findings are similar for male who kill female acquaintances, 53%. Females who kill male acquaintances predominantly use a knife, 47%, as well as females who kill female acquaintances, 45%. Results for male killing male and female strangers remain consistent with the findings for acquaintance, as do females who kill both male and female strangers. All right, so we'll read this one. In another study, Quinton and Noon sought to examine, this is 2014, solved and unsolved homicides in Indianapolis from 2004 to 2011, using a sample size of 829 documented homicides that evaluated victim-offender relationships with the method of homicide weapon for solved and unsolved murders. Of the 608 solved murders, acquaintance homicide had the greatest frequency with 326, 53%. Of the solved acquaintance homicides, 81% were committed by firearm. Similar, 81% of homicides committed against a stranger were products of firearms, although stranger homicides only comprised 15% of the sample. So this one is based out of Taiwan. Their results were different because of, first, the definition of homicide is slightly different in Taiwan than it is in the U.S. So attempts to kill and assault are excluded in the homicide definition of the U.S. And with that definition, disparity may create a risk to generalize the findings from Taiwan homicides to the U.S. Also, that gun ownership in Taiwan is minimal. Unlike the U.S., gun ownership is constitutional right. And with this Karen Reed case, 2.0, prior to Celebrite testimony, their expert witness for the state, which was Jessica Hyde, she testified at a case in Maryland that because of her testimony, if I remember correctly, put someone in jail, in prison. Now they're finding out that her methodology was skewed to the point where that case in Maryland is up in the Supreme Court right now on appeal. And the defense, Alessi, wanted to bring this up in her testimony to show the jury how her testimony is not going to be reliable. And it just happened recently, this Maryland case. And the prosecutor, Hank Brennan, I say Hank because with the closed captioning, it kept saying honk. So Hank was saying how the defense, Alessi, is trying to dehumanize Jessica Hyde by invoking constitutional rights. The fact that he used invoking constitutional rights as if it's a dirty word. How dare he invoke constitutional rights? Oh, so bad. So bad. So, as I mentioned earlier, Celebrite changed their programming to accommodate their client, which is law enforcement, in regards to the timestamp of how long to die in cold. Every other accredited company that does forensic data is able to see the timestamp, but not at Celebrite because they changed their software so that, if I remember her testimony correctly, does not show up initially. You still can find it, but it's hidden in a way that you have to look for it. It doesn't just come up naturally like all the other data forensic programs do. And this company will be testifying at Bryan Kohberger's trial for the state. So it'll be interesting to see how many other cases in the future will be brought up because of Celebrite forensic data information. So let's go to, so this one's OSHA and Williams in 2013. They're looking at juveniles between the ages of 10 and 17. And their findings reveal that 60% of the incidents were acquaintance friend homicide and 30% were stranger homicide. And the most popular weapon was using a gun, which accounted for 86% of the homicides. Even though those findings determined that there is not a statistically significant relationship between the weapon used and the victim-offender relationship. So Pelletier and Pizarro will definitely look into this more. This is 2018, conducted a study examining the covariates of weapon choices in homicide events. Their data set consisted of 821 total homicides that occurred in Newark, New Jersey from 1999 to 2007 and in Rochester, New York from 2000 and 2014. Rochester, New York is considered more of the Finger Lakes region, a little bit more central. This study presented two research questions. First, what factors influence the use of a particular type of weapon in a homicide? Second, how does the method of weapon retrieval or lack thereof affect the choice of weapon? The dependent variable for the first question is the type of weapon used to carry out the homicide, aggregated into firearm, 68%, cutting or blunt object is 21%, and other weapons is 10.1%. The second dependent variable refers to the retrieval of the weapon, coded as other, which is 5.4% on scene, 12.2%, and carried 82%. Independent variables for this study included location, inside or outdoors. The mode is face-to-face or other. Alcohol is yes or no. Number of offenders and number of victims, which is continuous. Motive is other, drug or gang, dispute, robbery, domestic. Threat, yes or no. Planned, yes or no. Victim offender relationship, intimate family, friends or acquaintance, stranger. Victim offender gender, male or female. Victim offender ethnicity, other, Latino, African American. victim offender drug dealer, gang member, yes or no, and victim offender age, which is continuous in regards to statistics. Relevant to the present study, 60% of the victim offender relationship observations were friends, acquaintances, 23% were strangers, and 17% were intimate family. Pelletier and Pizarro, which is 2018, ran a multinomial logistic regression to estimate the probability of one outcome occurring relative to a reference category. Relative to homicides involving strangers, friend and acquaintance homicides are more likely to be committed with a knife or blunt object as opposed to firearm. The method of weapon retrieval did not result in statistical significance for victim-offender relationship. Pizarro, Holt, and Pelletier in 2019 explored the situational transactions of homicides and how those transactions differed based on incident weapon and the use of a firearm. This study encompassed a mixed methods approach. Quantitatively, data from 705 homicides from the Newark Homicide Project analyzed the depending on descriptive frequencies, Bivret chi-square tests of independence, comparison of means, and multivariate logistic regression to estimate the probability of a firearm used to commit homicide relative to other weapon choices. The independent variables included planned aggression, drug-related, gang-related, victim-offender relationship, setting, mode, number of victims, and number of offenders. Victim-offender relationship is coded into 3 subgroups: intimate, familial, friends, acquaintance, and stranger. Qualitatively, 297 homicide incidents were recorded in Microsoft Word documents, which were transferred into NVIVO. I'm not a fan of Microsoft Word. We do not get along. So let's see what happened here. It just kind of tells you how it goes through it. And so here we see that the descriptive statistics revealed that 77.7% were committed using a firearm and 22.2% were committed by other means: knife, blunt object, hands, feet, other. Most of the victims and offenders had an acquaintance type relationship, 38.4%, when compared to intimate, familial, stranger relationship. I don't like that intimate and familial and stranger all in one. A stranger relationship is statistically significant, increasing the odds of a firearm homicide by 5.929. Qualitatively, the themes that emerged through Pizarro, Holtz, and Pelletier's analysis included doing crime, establishing the moral order, and demanding esteem. Homicides using firearms fall under the doing crime theme, which emerged in 73% of firearm homicides. Firearms were part of the lifestyle of offenders and victims, even if they did not know each other. So that shows how it is not an personal, intimate crime. It's just do it and move on. It's just a means to an end. So whereas with intimate and relative relationships in Decker, 1993, findings related to intimate and relative relationships and weapon used varied from the aforementioned findings regarding acquaintance-stranger relationships. Among friends, romantically linked persons, and relatives, however, the use of a weapon involving some form of personal contact, such as knives, clubs, hands, was nearly doubled that than for other categories. The more intimate the relationship, the greater chance that a more personal weapon will be used. Intense relationships seem more likely than more casual relationships to be insulated against the purposive efforts required in using a weapon. So here in this one with Decker, 1996, he wanted to further explore the classification of relationship types into different categories. So they categorized friends, relatives, and romantic links into the intimate group and classified acquaintances and strangers into their own respective groups. Firearms were used 363 times. Physical contact was used 142 times. Intimate homicides have been known to be more expressive than instrumental in nature. So remember, expressive means reactive, self-defense, impulsive, whereas instrumental is planned out, well thought out, and executed for minimal risk, which had some counterintuitive results. So when physical contact was the primary weapon used, more instrumental motives were present for intimate, which that makes sense. These findings contradicted previous results where physical contact was more expressive in nature, correct? Meaning physical contact was less premeditated and more of an emotional response. Decker suggests that intensity of relationship is not as strong of a predictor in instrumental or expressive motive as previously studied. So here in Fox and Allen's, so here he talks about how it's a two-way correspondence analysis places males who kill male family members and males who kill female family members, and females who kill female family members in the same results group, and had three categories of victor-offender relationship. Are more likely to use blunt objects or no weapon at all to facilitate the homicide. And with this information, it rendered inconsistent results because of the misclassification of boyfriends and girlfriends. Because what he did is he classified boyfriends and girlfriends into the acquaintance category, which, no, absolutely not. And they were doing that in regards to like family, which is intimate, and then saying the acquaintance is boyfriend or girlfriend. But they're not your acquaintance. That's in a relationship. That's intimate. So then with Pelletier and Pizarro's, conclude that relative to incidents involving strangers, family intimate partner homicides are more likely to be conducted using a knife or blunt object. Also relative to homicides involving strangers, other weapons, hand, feet, motor vehicle, fire, ropes, pillows, and deprivation of food are more likely to be used in family intimate partner relationships or homicides, which makes sense because those are hand, feet, fire, ropes, motor vehicle, I guess, pillows. These results conclude that the closer the relationship, the less lethal of a weapon used to commit the homicide. That makes no sense. Moreover, in their qualitative analysis component, their mixed methods approach concluded that other weapon types, knives, blunt objects, bricks, motor vehicles, and the offender using their own hands to beat or strangle the victims, fit the theme of establishing moral order. These incidents occur in a more private setting, involving less planned aggression and more emotional in nature. Okay, well then that makes sense. Additionally, their quantitative findings suggest that 70% of intimate family friend homicides are committed using methods other than firearms. So here is one that's out of Spain, and this one they kind of flipped with expressive and instrumental. There's expressive is, from what we've been reading thus far in the U.S., is expressive is reactionary. Either self-defense or impulsive. And instrumental takes time. It's planned out. There's a personal gain for it. They make sure they have less of a risk. And here in Spain, their expressive is previous threats, violence, previous breakup, previous conflict, asphyxiation, stab wounds, gunshot, blunt object. It's all over the place. And they're using it as expressive violence. And then for instrumental is strangulation, burns, and intoxication, which is so random. And that they are inconsistent. And it's been criticized because the way it's been categorized or classified as expressive when it's talking about gunshots and strangulation, which is two totally different things. A gunshot is